Hello, everyone. I'm Deborah Evans, LLG's Chief Executive, and I'm joined this week by Dennis Hall, our Bulletin Editor. Hello, Dennis.
Hi, Deborah.
Now, this week, we take a look, as we really should in the public sector, at the key aspects of what happened during the Grenfell Tower disaster, with a particular focus upon what the final report said about the council at the heart of this tragedy and its tenant management organisation, the TMO for short. Now, we need to learn lessons from this tragedy, especially in relation to leadership and governance, and how councils and officials can establish meaningful and effective relationships with those that they serve. Those relationships failed badly here. So how did the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea and the TMO take their eye off safety considerations in the refurbishing of Grenfell Tower? Dennis.
Well, Deborah, as you say, that is the central question that we'll be looking at this morning. But let me begin with a brief introduction. It's now more than 7 years after the deaths of 72 people in the Grenfell Tower fire. The report of the public inquiry into the causes was finally published, as we now know, on the 4th of September. And it forms a devastating verdict on the incompetence, the dishonesty, and greed that made the disaster possible. Sir Martin Moorbeek's report paints a horrifying picture of failures in the construction industry, the council, regulators, and central government. But we focus today, as you've mentioned, on the findings of the report in relation to the authority at the centre of this disaster, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Centrally, we must remember Moorbeek's report said at the launch, the simple truth is that the deaths that occurred were all avoidable. And the report covers a vast range of issues in relation to contractors, architects, and other government bodies. But again today, we will focus upon what was said about the council's role in the tragedy, and also the TMO and its building control team. Other aspects are covered in the accompanying Grapevine podcast. Now, the findings are frankly, utterly scathing, but it is only right, as you say, Deborah, that we share this with our members. The detail of this report is part of the important process of lessons being learned, so that these circumstances never happen again. And I should mention as well that everything that we cover in the report today, the commentary in this vlog is taken from the report and its findings. Deborah.
Well, I know that the inquiry chair said that the TMO, the Tenant Management Organisation, who is in effect the landlord, had lost sight of the fact that residents were people who depended on it for a safe and decent home and the privacy and dignity that a home should provide.
Well, that's right. And in the years before the disaster, the TMO allowed its relationship with Grenfell residents to deteriorate to such an extent that it involved distrust, dislike, personal antagonism, and anger. All of this is in the report, and it goes further, and that this amounted to a serious failure to observe its basic responsibilities. And Moorbeek said, some in the tower saw the landlord as an uncaring and bullying overlord that belittled and marginalised them, while the housing officials regarded some of the residents as militant troublemakers. The result, of course, was a toxic atmosphere fueled by mistrust on both sides.
Well, this all comes down to relationships, Dennis. There appeared to be a lack of person-centric decision-making. Now, we heard from the LGSCO, the Ombudsman, at our Monitoring Officers Conference last week, that decisions must remember the individuals at the heart of them.
Well, of course, that's obviously right, Deborah. The report stated that the council, by the way, and the TMO showed, again, another quotation, a persistent indifference to fire safety, particularly the safety of vulnerable people. And the council's oversight of the TMO was described as weak. Now, the inquiry found that Robert Stack, the TMO chief executive, had an entrenched reluctance, again, the words of the report itself, entrenched reluctance to inform his overseers about fire safety matters. The report described this as a serious failure.
Now, Dennis, I think it's concerning how a them and us situation developed, where everyone hunkered down and were unable to view things from a different perspective and literally go back to basics on their purpose. And the report also tells us that even after the disaster, there were more significant failures. The landlord's failure to gather information on disabled and vulnerable people that might assist with their evacuation in the event of a fire. Here, the report stated it amounted to a basic neglect of its obligations in relation to fire safety. And in the immediate aftermath of the fire, the council's emergency response was muddled, slow, indecisive and piecemeal, with aspects demonstrating a marked lack of respect for human decency and dignity.
Well, yes, that's right. And it was said to have, and I quote again, left many of those immediately affected feeling abandoned by the authority and utterly helpless. And let's not forget as well, there's another dimension to this. Many Muslim residents were observing Ramadan, but according to the report, the council had no regard for their cultural or religious needs, and people suffered a significant degree of discrimination in ways that could and would have been prevented if appropriate guidance had been properly observed. And Chief Executive Nicholas Holgate came in for some criticism, and according to the report again, he was unduly concerned for the council's reputation and was not capable of taking effective control.
And it wasn't just the chief executive, Dennis. The inquiry specifically concluded that financial considerations had driven a decision by the Director of Housing, Laura Johnson, to slow down the installation of self-closing door mechanisms. And this was despite warnings from the London Fire Brigade that their absence compromised fire escape routes. Now, the report notes that this decision was taken by her without having taken any advice about the consequences for the safety of residents. So let's also take a closer look at the council's TMO organisation, which was directly in charge of the refurbishment. It was appointed by the council to run its housing stock. Now, according to the report, its chief executive, Robert Black, established a pattern of concealment in relation to fire safety matters, and the TMO treated the demands of managing fire safety as an inconvenience. Now, the inquiry established that the landlord's initial motive for cladding Grenfell Tower was to improve its physical appearance and to prevent it looking like a poor relation to a building next door. Now, the inquiry also detailed a relentless focus on cost, both by the council and the TMO.
Turning now to building control, frankly, the report says it failed to perform. The report made critical findings about the council's building control department. It found that the council's division had failed to perform its statutory function of ensuring that the design of the refurbishment complied with building regulations. John Hoban, the building control surveyor responsible for Grenfell Tower, was overworked, inadequately trained, and had a very limited understanding of the risks associated with the use of ACM panels. The report says that the building control department therefore bears a considerable responsibility for the dangerous condition of the building immediately on completion of the cladding work.
Thank you, Dennis. Now, our accompanying Grapevine podcast will look at other important aspects of the Grenfell Tower report, including the report's recommendations. And our main coverage of the Grenfell report is in Bulletin 33, with further items in Bulletin 34. And you can get coverage of many, many more items from the Bulletin by listening to the Grapevine podcast. So that's it until next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye now.